Kia ora everybody, I'm Rochelle Stewart from Huia Community Aotearoa. We're just waiting for people to sign in now. We've got people just coming in. While you're waiting, maybe you could pop in the chat where you're based. I'm here in Te Whanganui Atara in Wellington. A bit grey and cloudy, but sort of warmish, so and no wind. So pop in the chat where you're from. Kia ora Bob from Dunedin. Jenny from Hamilton, kia ora. Kia ora Scott. Alex. Another Wellingtonian, that's good. Kia ora Kamal, nice to see you again. Thanks, I think you get the best points because you've joined every session, so well done. It's nice to see you again. Kia ora Julie.
Thank you very much, thanks.
Kia ora Valerie. Kia ora Charlie. Not very far from me. I'm in Pitaoni here in Petone, so just up the road from you. All right, so welcome to today's session, Why Improving Community and Government Relationships Matter. This is a partnership between Huia Community Aotearoa, Inspiring Communities and Volunteering New Zealand. So just to start, I'm going to hand you over to David Hanna from Inspiring Communities, who's going to start with a karakia for us.
Kia ora tātou, he karakia mō tēnei hui. Mōri oho, mauri tū, mauri ora, tia tātou. Haumi e, hui e, tahiki e.
Thanks, David. Well, welcome everybody. Great to have you. This is the fourth in our summer series, here Raupapatanga o te Raumati. So it's been a very full-on month for us here at Huia, but really great to reach out across the country. This is the sort of post-COVID or current COVID world where now we're online, and we can open up our events and our kōrero across the country. So it's really great to have you on board, and thanks for joining us. So today we're going to share with you a little bit about the work that's been ongoing. So we have been working at Huia with a number of community leaders who put up their hand last year to work with us on how to improve the relationship between the community sector and government. So this is something that came up during COVID. So we held 3 workshops in February this year, and some of this kōrero today will pick up on that. We also want to refer to the 2 reports. David will talk about the Inspiring Communities report, and then Huia partnered with Volunteering New Zealand, Philanthropy New Zealand and the Centre for Social Impact as well last year. And out of that research on the impacts of COVID on the sector, this was quite a common subject that came up, talking about relationships with government, how important they are for our sector, how they could do with some improvement. We did see some changes happening, and we're keen to help drive those changes going forward. So it's going to be a great kōrero. There'll be David and I will also have a breakout session. There will be opportunity to provide feedback in the chat box anytime that you want, any questions that you have along the way. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll get to a sort of next steps point from here about as a sector, what we want to see going forward. And this kōrero will join the work that was done in February. We're hoping to get to a point of some sort of don't know what it'll be, an opinion piece, a white paper, a discussion document going forward, so that we've actually captured all the fantastic recommendations and ideas and hopes for the future that we have in this space. So now I'm going to hand you over to David, and just before I do that, I will talk to you a little bit about after today's session at 1 o'clock. So we will finish on time. We aim to finish on time for the last half an hour, so 1 to 1:30. If you have time, you're welcome to stay online. So we will be here, happy to separate people into breakout rooms if you want to extend your networks. We always get a really wide variety of people across the motu online, so it's really great opportunity to meet new people, have a bit of a chance to just chat and make some new relationships. So that's completely optional if you'd like to do that. So we will start to go to our slides just as I talk a little bit about who we are as a sector and our interdependency with government. So it's no news in our sector that we deliver services. And that is a very common view outside our sector that's what we do, particularly with government. They're aware of the contract for services that a number of our groups have across the sector. However, that's not just what we do. We do a whole assortment of other things. I'm not going to read them all out. We will have these slides and we'll send them out to you after today. So don't feel that you need to read it all or copy it all down. But it's really important to think of our sector as much broader than just service delivery. So that's a very important part of what we do. It's a lot of what we get our funding for and how it's based, but it's not the only thing that we do. We're a core part of civil society and making sure that there's democratic processes in place. We work to achieve better society, longer term systemic changes. We're embedded in the community, so we have a really good understanding about what's required. We saw this particularly happening during lockdown, when some of the other areas of government or funders or business were struggling to understand what was happening. We were embedded in those communities and knew straight away. We build social cohesion. We give people a sense of belonging and participation. We help grow new community leaders coming through and volunteers. On the call that we had last week, where we were talking about support for nonprofit CEs, that was something that really came up, that the majority of us had learned and started their roles through volunteering and then gone on to have professional roles through all the work and the experience that we'd had, lived experience of learning along the way. And we provide opportunities for the public to participate, both in the societies that we have and into government, which is a core component of democracy, to have the voice of the people that we work with up in that level. So let's move to the next slide. So our sector is core to government. Don't worry too much about this diagram on the right. Why I included it, even though it's probably a little bit small to see. You don't need to read it, but that's actually representative of where the touch point of our sector is in, if not all, almost every government department that there is. So there's so many different points, even though the Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector maps into DIA, into Hapai Hapori. It's in all of government intervention and response and working together. So it's really important to think of us as really our sector as a fundamental component of the government's wellbeing budget. If you remember, that was tied to the Treasury's Living Standards framework, and talking about not just finance or economics or GDP, that you don't measure the wellbeing of society like that. Instead, there's they've split them into 4 capitals: to nature, human, social and economic capital, so that you need to have a balance across all those areas to really ensure the well-being of our society. So we're a fundamental component of government delivering that. We help democracy work properly. There's things like the Open Government Partnership that our sector is involved in, civil society voices, so up into government, onto social issues, onto legislation, the formation of legislation. We provide a vital link between communities and government. As we mentioned before, we're embedded there, we understand communities, we know where to go and what works and what doesn't work, and how to connect and what's needed. And we help explain the views of the people to government, and we help society be heard. So our community organisations, particularly at the peak body level, we work really hard to bring that voice up into government policy decision making, into funders, whether that's government or philanthropy or business, so that people have a better understanding of actually what the needs are. So we'll move to the next slide. And why? And then on the reverse, so that's why we're important to government. Why is government important to us? So they generate a significant amount of our sector's mahi, as we know. They're a major funder. So there's a lot of contracts for delivery on behalf of the government that we roll out into our communities. And we are definitely, I wouldn't say at the mercy of, but we're certainly influenced by the government policy decision making that happens. And we're very big on trying to improve the way that policies are made that then trickle down through the cabinet system, through the government system, down into our communities and directly impact either positively or negatively on the communities that we serve. All right, so the next slide. So I'm going to hand you over now to David, and he's going to talk about really why this matters, that we need to be improving relationships with between the sector and government.
Kia ora tātou anō, and it's appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation that we are hosting, and from the team in Inspiring Communities to sort of bounce around and with us all collectively reflect about these patterns of relationships, and particularly, my focus is why is this relationship important? And I sort of want to start and just sort of step back and give a little bit of a historical view, because we're sort of where we're at because things that have happened or haven't happened prior to this point. And the first thing is, it's sort of stating the obvious, but it's reflecting on the fact that about 40 years ago, New Zealand, launched into the whole new public management system, which was, broadly termed the neoliberal sort of approach. And that's had a significant understanding of how we understand and experience government, and therefore how we relate to government. Increasingly, there's criticism of that. And I was just talking to a retired professor from Victoria University recently. He sort of says basically that was sort of insights and knowledge pulled out of managerialism in the United States from the sort of the multinational sort of companies that was sort of pretty quickly failed not long after it was sort of moved into the public sector. The key point is, I think the current system, the current government system, is no longer fit for purpose. That approach and some of the assumptions in that it's questionable whether it was fit for purpose, 30 years ago. But certainly the experience of COVID-19 has really highlighted some really key aspects globally about the limitations of the current framing and understanding around government operations. So, and the examples obvious that we're all aware of, I'm sure, was when we did go into lockdown, and the whole ability of a centralised the Wellington system to actually make decisions and organise at local levels. It wasn't possible. It had to be more flexible, and at the same time, local hapu, iwi, community organisations all stepped up and largely self-organised. So that was one really powerful experience. Also at the whole fiscal level of the whole government's attitudes towards borrowing, and that whole discourse that's happened about the economy versus the people. And generally speaking, those nations that tried to protect the economy and sort of not go into lockdown, in a sense, ended up the economy suffering more because they actually sort of disregarded the human relationships and people aspect, if you like. So there's a really big global discourse around that. So that brings us to this point now where, I, for one, and a whole lot of other people think there's a really critical opportunity to reimagine and to reframe this thing we understand as the relationships between government and community. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the reawakening and the breathing life into the Tiriti o Waitangi partnership is another really powerful resource and historical strength we've got if we actually embrace that to bring Indigenous knowledge into this reframing process. So, that's big historical context, just sweeping over it, that sort of says now is a really critical time to be having this conversation and to be reframing that. So the next slide I'm going to go on to is a little bit of a deeper dive into the experience of going into lockdown. one of the things in inspiring communities is that we really value the whole thing around learning by doing, and particularly drawing on the whole complexity thinking and writing. When you've got radical uncertainty, which is what we are now experiencing. I mean, we don't know whether, Australia has just changed in Queensland because of the pandemic. We don't know, we just know things could change quite quickly. And that's about a pandemic, but at other levels across our worlds, there's a whole lot of other uncertainties, the whole inequality, the housing crisis. No one knows if the bubble is going to pop, if there is a bubble, if it's stable. So we live with radical uncertainty. So we've got to be, the way we learn is through actively reflecting. So in Inspiring Communities, we had this radical change about this time last year when we went to lockdown, and a whole lot of things happened. There was limited planning. People just responded in the moment with the knowledge they had and the resources what they had. So in Inspiring Communities, we thought there was a powerful opportunity to harvest the learnings from that. So not long after the lockdown, or the latter part of last year, around October, we had a whole process of talking to a whole cross-section of people in communities. And I'm not just talking about community organisations. I'm talking local government officials, local iwi leaders, local business leaders, the whole slice of people who make up communities. And we called that Shaping the Future. There's a picture that's a cover of the report. Kia whakamana I te whakawhanaki a hapari, enabling community-led development. And then out of that, we distilled, these sort of 6 key themes, which won't be news to us, I'm sure, that we said, this is what happened and this is what enabled happened. And more importantly, going forward, let's not forget this experience. And how can we use this knowledge and what we experienced to reshape the system into the future? And the themes that emerged was around decentralizing, actually allow decisions to be made closer to the action, recognize and respect difference, involve the whole diversity of this thing we call communities. There's not a Wellington designed solution that can be parachuted in. There's a whole process of creating that with people in place. Valuing people and relationships. I mean, that whole experience about, do we value the economy or do we value people, became almost a bit of a nonsense dichotomy that we had to wrestle with. But certainly it was the relationships and the social capital that facilitated a whole lot of things to happen quickly. So how do we bring that knowledge into moving forward? Embed collaboration, make that the default natural setting. Build local economic resilience and tolerate more risk. How do we create systems that enable things that are a little bit more edgy, unknown, to actually give it a go and be more tolerant? So those were the sort of 6 key themes that came out of that Shaping the Future. And it's interesting because we've had trouble trying to land those in central government, in one sense, having a really good dialogue about it. And I think that's part of the creative challenge. So if we go to the next slide, just my last slide, where I'm going to sort of say, well, what are the bright spots? Because while I'm sort of saying there's some critical change is happening around us, and how do we choose to respond to that? What I find, we find helpful is, in a more organic system, there are actually effective creative changes popping up all around the place. And sometimes it's just important for us to notice them and join the dots between those sort of and here I've listed some of them, and a lot of these interconnect, and there'll be others here, but here's just a quick list of some of the initiatives, the bright spots, which are already got life. They had energy and creativity prior to COVID, but in some ways COVID put more into focus. So as I mentioned, the whole Tiriti informed approaches, the whole iwi and hapu-led development, there's whole new legal constructs being developed that actually blend Indigenous knowledge with sort of Western or British law, case law and all that sort of stuff. Rochelle mentioned the well-being lens. the shift from a welfare focus to looking at well-being for now and for future generations, and that way that interconnect stuff. Globally, that's quite powerful stuff that we're doing there, but so is there some value in leaning into that more? The whole area of participatory democracy. I'm aware in Pororua, they're going to host a citizens assembly, which is going to be co-hosted by the Mana Whenua, Ngāti Toa, and a network of diverse people in that community to talk about the Climate Commission's recommendations. So there's a movement around that. The whole community-led development, local economic development, there's a focus, it could be environmental, like the, the whole habitat, the whole pest eradication network that is happening locally and nationally, those goals. There's a whole range of initiatives that are springing up. Some have an economic focus, a cultural focus, a social focus. There's initiatives around the co-production and co-design. And then there's also initiatives around democratizing the economy, which one expression of that is cooperatives. Or what's the way where local communities can develop their own economic infrastructure and have more active ownership. I'm aware of there's a network of savings pools around the economy, savings and loan pools. There's over 60 of these in local communities where people collectively organize their finances. So this is a sort of a quick overview of, if we stand back for the question, why is this partnership important between the community sector and the government sector? Well, it's sort of, in some ways, it's almost like reframing that question, because I would almost suggest that actually we are part of enhancing the public good. So we are sort of more connected than we are separate. And so I would suggest that I want us to reclaim that we are part of the public service, and that we and all our different focuses in that are in the service of the public. And if we start to rethink or reframe that potentially that helps actually enliven and invigorate some of how we approach this. So I'll leave it there, Rochelle, and then have some breakouts to have some reflection or kicking any of that and your ideas around would be good.
Kia ora, thanks, David. Such a kind of interesting time, like as we were talking the other day in prep for today, we're actually excited, right, about going forward. Despite the many challenges that exist, we feel like there's some really fantastic things that have happened through COVID that has really sort of highlighted the ability and the flexibility of our sector to really respond in a way that's really meaningful, that built a lot of bridges, provided for a lot of community people, provided a lot of expertise and advice as well to government and funders and business about what to do and what was needed. So the next thing we're going to do is split you into a breakout room, and we're going to ask what changes your organisation saw from government during COVID. And I want you to take some notes, because when you come back, I want you to put that into the chat box, and we're going to include that in the next discussion that's going to come up after that. So we're going to split you in. I will cut and paste that question, so don't worry if you missed it. I'll cut and paste it, and you will be able to see it in there. Just make sure that everyone gets a chance to talk. So just be mindful of everybody else in your group, so that everyone gets a kind of equal time. We're going to give you sort of 5 to 7 minutes to do that. All right, so as we're coming back, feel free to put in the chat what sort of areas and what things you saw happen with government during lockdown and COVID, post-COVID. We're kind of in a still COVID environment. So Jane, was that continue at the same length, or was it extended or expanded contracts? and or interested to know if it was they were adaptable in terms of the change of service delivery as well?
No, probably just continued as they were.
Okay.
But I suppose it depends how much liberty you have with your contract manager to actually
Yes.
be sensible, or how constrained your funding is.
Yes, we saw
Sometimes
definitely
some funding's quite broad, and so you can lots of wiggle room. Some is more constrained.
Yeah, we saw some change and expand, which was great to see, but yeah, not all, obviously. And also we saw a flexibility around changing of terms of delivery and altering service delivery. So that was good. Alex is saying contractor was extended. Garth saying more generosity, more responsiveness, and much more flexibility. Solve the problem rather than jump, high, have to do more delivery, increase delivery. So keep adding into your chat as we go about some of the things that we saw. We'll just get the PowerPoint back up and look at the slide. Yeah, that's good, David, that you didn't wait to see what was essential, that you knew and you took action. So some of the feedback shows the positives were increased engagement from and with government. So they were more likely to reach out, particularly those who had trusted relationships. More honest conversations. This came out in our research that people were more able to be open and upfront about what the actual needs of the communities were. Shifting from transactional to trusted relationships. So rather than purely just being about contractual relationships and decisions, that it was more shifting into actually trusted relationships. We saw more funding released and easier to access that funding. Some of the negatives we saw was difficulty getting key information shared into the right areas. There was so much information coming up from the communities, very difficult where to know to put that in the right place, so it actually enabled and support coming back down into those communities. Difficulty getting active participation in decision making. So there was a lot of very quick decision making was done for obvious reasons, but there wasn't always engagement or consultation or from the community sector. An example was food banks. So the food banks were already running and expanding very quickly in that first three-week period before the emergency management were given grants to then roll out food banks around the country. So it could have, with proper consultation, instead there were already food banks existing across the country, so they could have gone, the money could have gone to them instead of setting up another process that was not necessarily correct or able to access where the greatest need was. We saw the same with money for migrant communities, so migrants who were stuck here. That money was contracted out to an external provider to try to help people get housing and money, and then eventually get money to return home once the borders reopened. But there was it was contracted out, and they didn't actually have the connections in the migrant communities, so there were delays in actually getting it to the right people. And lack of community consultation, certainly around funding and where resources went. So let's take that into the next conversation. So we'll shift to the next slide and talk about this need of reframing relationships. So David mentioned this as he spoke. There's this kind of idea about that we actually feel hopeful and positive going forward and reframe our mindsets so that we actually work as equal partners. We see ourselves as equal partners. Just bear with me because I realise that there's a lot of power dynamics go on with major funders, but that we have more of a relationship that's based on collaborative rather than competitiveness, that we start to feel engaged with government in a positive way, that we view them positively, that we think about educating them, about sharing, that we actually sit at the table, and make sure that we're sitting positively at the table. So it's not easy and it can be tough. However, COVID has really been an opportunity to start to kind of shift our thinking and how we work with government, how we actually get and how we actually start to work to kind of enact some of these long-term systemic changes that are needed. So we'll look at the next slide. So this is the idea of shifting from transactional to transformative relationships and trusted relationships. So it's the difference of having concern for the community. So our sector is very values-based, and it's not just about a contract. It's about helping the people who fund us really understand the needs of our communities, sitting at the table with them and explaining to them this is actually what we need versus maybe what you're funding or how the funding criteria is set, that doesn't actually match what the core mahi that we do, and starting to have those conversations, be really open and start to build a level of collaboration and trusted relationship that's based on better long-term values rather than just short-term contractual relationships. We started to see this during COVID happening with government. Really what we're starting to see is that kind of dropping back now, and this is part of this piece of work that we're doing today is to work about how that can shift. So right, so let's stop the screen sharing. So now we're keen to have a conversation with you, David and I, on what should we as a sector be letting go of and picking up. So to improve this relationship, yes, we want to see changes in government. We have different asks, we have different priorities. Some of them are the same, but we want to see different priorities. But essentially, actually, we need to change as a sector as well. And we've learned that, we've seen that during COVID. We've seen better collaboration. We've seen more innovation coming through. There's another piece of work Hui is doing around this work as well. But we want to hear from you. So start putting in the chat about what should we as a sector be letting go of and picking up. What are some of the new priorities that we think that we should be doing? So Scott, you've put recruitment and retaining key staff. Absolutely. And one of the things about funding is long-term funding will enable you to not have this kind of fixed term, short-term contract that is very common in the sector, and it's all tied towards the way that funding models work. So best practice, there's a long one from Scott. Sharing expertise to save on duplication. Absolutely. So it's very common to see the same things being done in different regions. So as we work at Hui across the country, we tend to see that, and it would be great to have more sharing, a sort of platform for a way to share. Yeah, more confidence to negotiate on our own terms, absolutely. And I think that's partly about sort of positioning ourselves. This work that we did in the workshops in February was talking about core messaging that we could all use and share together to really demonstrate who we are as a sector.
Michelle, I wonder, I mean, I think that's a really good point about that, and the reframing about the confidence is, I mean, what if we just actually claim or speak from, we are part of the public service, what if we, and I mean, one of the things that highlighted during the COVID experience was not so much asking for permission and seeking all the time. So, if we believe our partnerships, as all partnerships with the people we work with government agencies, there should be a reciprocal and respectful relationship, then how do we operate in a way that isn't a master-servant relationship? I mean, yes, we know all the dilemmas around funding and competitive tendering. We all probably experience that in all different forms. But what happens if we just change our mindset, that we are part of this, just claiming it? And in a sense, I think iwi are doing that. In a sense, they're just asserting their tiraranga tiratanga, and they're actually acting from that. And it's quite a different sort of dynamic it sets off. So I don't know what people think about that.
Yes, I agree, David. I think it's that thing about when you sit at the table, you come with your own mana. So you come in a place of strength rather than a place of deficit. And that can be quite tough to do, right? If you are if you're struggling to keep your organization going and money's very tight and you feel like you can be very emotive in that space if your communities are just regularly not getting it. But I think getting the resources they need, but ultimately we need to sit very clearly, and I agree with you, sit very clearly in confidence, say, this is who we are, this is what we offer, this is what our ask is, and here we are, and let's work on how to respond on that together. So more feedback. So Jenny's talking about regular communication as a sector and regular feedback. So what works? Gar's talking about greater awareness of our bigger community building role of the sector beyond program delivery, which was one of the slides, that first slide that I showed. Yes, letting go of organisational egos. Absolutely. I think, what I'm seeing since COVID is a lot of collaboration, a lot more broader, wider conversations amongst ourselves. And I'm really happy to see that. I'm really happy to see stepping away from that kind of constrained funding model, which actually breeds competition, which doesn't do any of us any value, really. It's just a win-lose kind of scenario, actually wanting to collectively collaborate and have these conversations. Thanks, Kamal. You're going to send us a report about your findings. That would be great. No problem, that you need to leave at 1. Qualitative info. Yes, Jenny. So this is, we're working on our data set to do some more analysis on some of the qualitative data that's come through versus the quantitative. So we've got some more stuff coming out in April around that. So Gar's talking about sharing of the back office functions. So there's so much that we could share in terms of finance, in terms of HR, in terms of boards. Wouldn't it be great if boards, maybe sat across, I don't know, that's my idea, sat across multiple organisations instead of, the work to keep and maintain a board for each individual small organisation.
I put one there about the role of Huia, because I mean, a number of people maybe on this discussion will be aware of various discussions we've had in the sector about sector-wide conversations and how we organise ourselves to address the very same questions we're asking today. So I was part of that process going back a while, and out of that came Huia, and I mean, I wasn't highly involved, but I had a sense, well, here was an opportunity to collaborate in a way and network. And, I don't think we've realised that. I think we've been our own worst enemies across our sector. And I'm not too sure what it is that we've held on to and haven't actually let go of some stuff to free us to move into another way of being more collaborative. So it's all very well for us to bang and criticise government for being siloed and, focusing and separated and all that sort of stuff. But often we just equally mirror that ourselves. And, and I think there's some courageous conversations we need to have within our some of our key networks about what do we need to do to actually move on, because it's critical.
I agree. So Jenny, you're talking about healthy governance with private sector input. I'm a big supporter of bringing in fresh new ideas and helping the resourcing deficit that is very common across our sector by bringing in things like in-kind support. It's great to have money, but money is not always what the issue is. And that's certainly what our research is showing. It's not always about funding. There's other things about service delivery, service design, innovation. So there's more themes coming through of smarter ways to work, use of technology, etc. I don't know how many organizations I speak to that don't necessarily use an automated payroll function, for example. So someone has to manually produce payroll. You can go to Thank You Payroll, they're free for NGOs. So that's my tip for today, if you're doing that. So I think, there's smarter ways that we can use technology. We're also looking at that in Huia, bringing some of that research of people who are doing that going forward. And Gar's talking about too busy with our heads down doing the mahi. Absolutely, I think it's very tough, and that is why Huia is in a good place, because we don't frontline service deliver. We actually instead partner with other organisations who are doing that, and we try to lead across at a national strategic way. So we actually have headspace and time to work on these bigger issues, to bring people together to start to try and find some solutions. Efficient compliance, absolutely, Jenny. So I'm just reading back. So Charles is talking about decision-making processes with the idea about speeding them up versus a thorough consultative and inclusive decision-making process. And that's what we saw in COVID lockdown, particularly a very good speeding up from government's side. So we saw money out faster, more of it, less accountability, so easier to access the money, less application processes, which was great. But now we're seeing dropping back to the traditional processes. So we've just got another minute or so. Scott's talking about smarter ways of doing things, does not necessarily overcome the resourcing. Absolutely, and we absolutely have to acknowledge that the long-term deficit of resourcing in the sector is definitely a major issue. So Charles is saying, how and why is there an acceptance at the level of society of excessive profit being made? I think in some ways, in terms of responsibility for our sector, we haven't spoken up enough. And there's a whole lot of reasoning around resourcing around that. But ultimately, we haven't spent a lot of our time telling our core messaging, I don't think, in public forums where people will hear that. And we know you can talk to pretty much any NGO and they'll say the difficulty they get in getting coverage in mainstream media versus business getting coverage. So there's a whole imbalance there that needs to change. It's difficult to get our voice into government, so that needs to change as well. So Alex is saying not enough recognition of Māori tikanga incorporated into everyday practices, e.g. koha. And absolutely, we've seen during these conversations that we've had as well, a lot of reference back to Te Ao Māori and the way that they operate and essentially how we can learn so much from our Indigenous communities here, our tangata whenua communities, and how they actually work, and that we could actually start to adopt some of those practices in a much more fulsome way. So last minute or so. Scott, what do you mean? What do we do to get reward? Can you just define that a little bit more?
Yeah, no, it was just relating to the comment above, essentially that we're addressing market failure, and when the market becomes the arbitrator of value, addressing market failure doesn't get market reward. We're simply filling the gap that the market doesn't fill. So how do we resource filling that gap? How do we resource helping people reduce consumption, helping people live better lives when it's not producing more, it's not enticing them to consume more? That's the challenge we have, and we should be able to address that under a well-being framework, but government is yet to match practice with rhetoric.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I
can't but agree with you. I can't but agree with you. And it's really interesting the number of organisations in the community sector that are directly trying to drive some of this change, right? This new thinking, environmental climate change, adaptation. There's so many when I look across the sector of organisations trying to drive this kind of hearts and minds change and how we actually live. There's a lot of work to be done for sure. But look, I am just going to finish up now. I'll hand over to David in a minute just to finish with a karakia. A reminder that those who want to stay on for another half an hour or so are welcome to do that. That's completely optional, but we will finish up in the next minute or so. Thank you so much for your input, and we will be in contact with you. There'll be just a short survey for your feedback on today. We'll also add the slide deck to that, and any other feedback that you'd like to add, feel free to add in there into the survey. We hope that you will participate in these ongoing conversations that we have. As David said, we need to be talking amongst ourselves. We need to have some courageous and hard conversations about how to work better, where the challenges are from our side, and really what we want to sit at the table with government for. What are we actually going to do that for, and how are we going to do it that's different than what we might have done in the past? So kia ora everybody, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll hand you over to David.
Kia tau, kia tātou katoa. Te ao, te aroha, me te muru tau, te hei mauri ora. Thank you, Rochelle and everyone.